Welcome, everybody, to the Art of Agile Development Book Club. I'm James Shore, and today we're discussing user stories. I'm very pleased to have Bill Wake joining us. Bill is an Agile coach known for the INVEST acronym for user stories, the Arrange-Act-Assert TDD pattern, and for articles at xp123.com. Bill, welcome.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here.
And I understand you also have a Twitch show.
Yeah, Fridays and Sundays, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern. At this point, I'm doing some live coding on Swift, a little application. I'm taking pictures of index cards and seeing if I can analyze them and do something with them. I don't know quite what yet. So
awesome. And if people wanted to watch that show, how would they find you? What username are you under?
Just go to xp123.com/Twitch and it'll forward you over to the real thing.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, I'm going to get things started today. As I said, we're discussing user stories, and I'm going to start by reading an excerpt from The Art of Agile Development. Stories. We plan our work in small, customer-centric pieces. Stories may be the most misunderstood idea in all of Agile. They're not requirements. They're not use cases. They're not even narratives. They're much simpler than that. Stories are for planning. They're the playing pieces of the planning game. That's it. Alistair Cockburn calls them promissory notes for future conversation. Each story is a reminder to talk about something the team needs to do. They're written on index cards or the virtual equivalent, so you can pick them up, move them around, and talk about how they fit into your plan. Because stories are just a reminder to have a conversation, they don't need to be detailed. In fact, detailed stories are a sign that people are missing the point. You're supposed to have a whole team, a team room, and talk together regularly. The story is the reminder, a way of sparking conversations about the details. Although stories are supposed to be brief, it's okay to add additional notes when it's helpful. If there's something important you want to remember or a technical detail you need to keep track of, go ahead and jot it down. Just don't feel obligated to add more detail. The card isn't meant to be a requirements document, just a reminder. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Although stories are short, they still have two important characteristics. First, stories represent customer value and are described in customers' terminology. They describe work that customers recognize and value, not implementation details. This allows your on-site customers to make informed prioritization trade-offs. Second, stories have clear completion criteria. It doesn't have to be written on the card, but on-site customers need to understand what it means for a story to be done and to be able to describe it when asked. So that's what the Art of Agile Development has to say, or the beginnings of what it has to say about user stories. And of course, Bill, you are famous for the INVEST acronym that I think most people are aware of, even if they didn't know you made it. Would you mind refreshing everyone's memory on what that is?
Oh, I didn't know there would be a quiz.
I should have warned you. Sorry about that.
Let's see. Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable is kind of the original formulation. I kind of substitute a couple of words now and then when I use it. I like to say scalable a lot instead of small because I don't know. I saw a lot of confusion around, how small is small and all that kind of stuff. And really what I want is the notion of kind of like Kent's knobs up to 11 thing. I want to be able to swing that range and get a story at whatever granularity is right for that moment. And then I definitely talk about kind of end-to-end a lot more because I've seen too many stories. They're just like, do some little piece out of the middle that no customer cares about and on its own. So, yeah, I've used it for helpful things. And if it's not helpful, don't use it.
Our first discussion prompt. Alistair Cockburn says, as I read it in the excerpt, that stories are promissory notes for future conversations. And yet many organizations use stories as a form of documentation instead. What do you see as the pros and cons of that approach? And again, I'd love to hear from all of you, go ahead and raise your hand and I will invite you to join the conversation. Bill, have you seen that? Have you seen that?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Docs?
Yeah, I won't surprise you that I'm kind of more on the promissory note end, but there's definitely organizations that, I don't know, they'll fill up Jira with this, tiny print stuff of all kinds of things, and they don't use phone books anymore, but little large documents with small fonts and that kind of stuff.
And why do you think they do that?
I think it's just there's a sense. Well, partly it's just kind of what was always done. Traditionally, there were requirements docs and whatever SPDs and MPDs and whatever all they decided to call them, and they want a home for that. And this is sort of the only piece of kind of like the agile processes laid out. It's like, where are you going to hook it to? Well, you throw it on the story. We got to track it somewhere and have to do it. And to some extent, I see it as building up too big a backlog. And, if we're going to have 6 months of analysis, we can't just let that sit around. We're not going to remember it. We can't hardly remember last week's. So they tend to want the documents and all that. I don't know, but at some point I'm projecting onto them. So who knows?
Yeah. I mean, obviously I'm on the promissory note end of the spectrum as well. And it does seem to me that, as with many things in Agile and particularly XP, people take what they originally were doing anyway and try to map that to Agile terminology rather than change their underlying fundamental behavior. What's the downside of that in your mind? I mean, what are they losing by taking this requirements heavy approach to stories?
Well, I think one thing they lose is kind of the flexibility. And, if you come in with the assumption you know everything to start with and you're just going to write it down and do it, you have a very different process going on than kind of what we're trying for in XP or other Agile things. We want that flexibility to go where we should go, not where we thought we should go, a year ago or whatever the time frame is. That's where I feel like they've done the worst. They've invested a lot, and now they feel tied to this sunk cost of the decisions they already made and the cost they spent.
Yeah,
it's a hard place.
One thing I see is I see organizations put a lot of effort into stories, and so much so that it becomes a real burden on the team, and particularly the product owners and product managers, depending on the titles they use. And I think it's exactly what you're saying, that you end up with sort of the sunk cost perspective of the world. We've put all this effort in, so we have to do what's on the card, or not. It's not a card. And I think that's actually one of the downsides of the virtual format is when it's an actual story card. I personally always use blue for my story cards. Mm-hmm. When it's an actually story card, there's only so much you can write. Whereas the electronic tools, they allow you to just go on for pages and pages and pages.
It always the same online, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Thomas Owens, I asked what about the pros and cons, and Thomas Owens spoke up on the Discord. And for those of you who aren't aware, there is a fantastic Discord conversation that tends to happen the week ahead of each of these live sessions. You can find that at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. That's AOAD2 for Art of Agile Development 2. And so I asked this question on the Discord, and Thomas Owens said, I don't think it's an either or choice. Why not both? I agree that the story should definitely start out as a promissory note for future conversations, especially since investing too much time and effort up front is wasteful in the lean sense of the word. It's one form of inventory in software development, right up there with writing code for stuff no one asked for. However, over time, you can evolve this to capture those conversations. How much to capture depends very much on context, risk, trust between team and stakeholders, depth of knowledge, and many more. Electronic tooling, I've used Jira and GitHub Issues, makes this better. Not only can you start with a promissory note for future conversations, but search and sort and filter to get the relevant views without throwing things away. Then you can also build up traceability from the inception of the ideas all the way through code changes. And he went on to say a little bit more, but so that's a very positive view of this sort of big tool-supported approach to stories. I have to admit, I'm a little cynical about it because I don't see people using it that way. I see people using it when the ability is there. It tends to get misused. What's your perspective on that, Bill?
Yeah, I feel like I'm just going to echo you a lot on this. I'm sure there's contexts where it's important to keep that and useful and all that stuff, but that's not the context I see in general. So I don't know. I wouldn't stop anybody that needed it. But
yeah, I'm working with a company right now that uses Azure DevOps, which is the latest in a long line of terrible co-optive names that Microsoft has come up for their tools. I think it used to be called Visual Studio Team System or something like that. But it's basically their Jira equivalent, their database thing, as well as much more. Um, and this organization uses it. I've taught them, and I don't know how well they're following through on this, but in theory, what they're doing is they're using Miro boards and cards to capture their initial stories and ideas, and then using ASDO, Azure DevOps, to store historical data as stuff happens, which is kind of this best of both worlds that Thomas is talking about. So what do you all think? Everybody who's out there watching this, love to hear your perspectives. Please raise your hand to chime in. Thomas, I see that you are on the line. So if you'd like to defend your perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Again, just use Zoom to raise your hand, and I will call on you. One of the things that seems like it potentially has value of this approach of using cards to begin with at ASDO is you do get that ability to keep things short to begin with, and then go into more detail and have that traceability, which is really important for some organizations. Although, I don't know, would you say that, have you seen people do a lot of looking back historically at previous information when they do that, Bill?
I can't say that I have. I mean, I really spent a few years in a healthcare organization, but and that's the only one that was even close to needing a traceability kind of thing. And even there, it just didn't seem to be part of the culture very much. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the ways you've seen people use for tracking their stories and creating their stories in the online age, the remote era?
Oh, I don't know. Jira seems to be the popular one among the groups I'm involved with. Yeah, for a little while you might run into version 1 or something, but I haven't seen that in a few years. I don't even know if it's still an active thing.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to the next discussion prompt. And again, love to hear your voices. Feel free to raise your hand and contribute your thoughts. So, of course, many people have heard of the Connectra template, although they don't often know where it came from. As an X, I want Y, so that Z. And that has a lot of adherence. And in a moment, I guess I'd like to hear about the preferred template that all of you have, if any. But Bill, are you familiar with the story behind the Connectra template?
I just tied it to Rachel Davis and the team picked it up there, but no real deeper thing than that.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I thought you might have a more of the story. My understanding is that Rachel Davies at Connextra in the UK came up with this format as a way of helping them. They found that, I think the story was that they were having trouble focusing on customer needs, and so they used this format to sort of help them give that focus. And I've certainly seen that. When teams are new to stories, they do tend to have trouble phrasing them in the terms of customer perspective. It tends to be more task oriented. Do you see that as well?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Yeah, what I see is like they struggle to find the words that, or I should say, they have a struggle to put it in terms of customer stuff at all. And there's definitely a tendency to kind of go a level in of kind of first cut design or something like that and talk about things talking together. And as a team member, I want things tested and, all that kind of stuff that no customer would sign up for if they didn't have to pay it. You tell them you have to do this. They go, okay, fine, I'll do it. But they're not asking for that,
Right. So, you just sort of said the downside of the Connectra format, which is that you can say anything as a team member, I want this. As an engineer, I want a database layer so that the code will persist its data. Right. Do you have a preferred format or a way of teaching people how to take this customer perspective?
I'm not super picky about it in practice, as long as it's kind of the stories are customer oriented. I worked with Industrial Logic for a while, and they liked a template they call role action context. It's sort of a shorter form without the tail piece about who it's for, but just instead of as a customer, I want to do X, it's just customer X's. And instead of shifting the focus to saying like, how do I know what the value is? I want that to be so obvious that it's valuable. And, I, as a patron, or patron checks out library book, I can see the value if I'm the patron or the person sponsoring the system or whatever. If I'm doing something so obscure, I can't see the value, I guess I would tag on there, but I kind of don't want that to be the case. When I write them myself, I just use anything. If there's only one customer, I just kind of write a little verb phrase, and sort the items, whatever. Mm-hmm. Anything to trigger me, it's like, I want it as a reminder. And if I got that, I'm okay.
Yeah. Yeah. This, as we're talking about this sort of inspires a thought in me, which is that I think you could trace a lot of the ills in Agile, a lot of the things that don't work properly back to lack of whole team, a team that doesn't include an on-site customer in the XP sense of the word. Somebody who's there who really understands and represents the customer perspective. Because I've always had sort of a negative reaction to templates, contextual format, and so forth. Although I understand that some people really get value out of them, so I'm not going to stop you from doing it. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to come to your house and rip up all your cards or delete your Jira database.
Deliver a deck is more like your style.
But it always frustrated me that people were going through all these hoops, because to me, who was fortunate in my first XP experience, we did have a good, strong on-site customer. In fact, we had a few too many, and figuring out how to balance all their demands was the challenge. And they weren't literally part of the team, but this was internal development for it was the developer website for an operating system company, not any of the ones that are still around, but it was a big operating system, very well known back in the day. And so we did the developer website. And so we had basically the marketing. This was a marketing activity for the company. We had all those folks who were part of this marketing effort. We sat with them. And so we just talked to them. And so this idea that we need to jump through hoops to get the customer's perspective was always kind of strange to me, because the way we did it was we said, you write the story. And then that was it. We got what the customers cared about, because they were the ones actually writing the stories. And so we didn't need to worry about, formatting. The main thing was, in the beginning, they did have some reluctance to write the story, but we'd say, what do you want us to do? And they'd start to talk and say, hey, could you write this down? And I carried index cards around with me for that purpose. Bill, were you on that original C3 team? I know you've been around with XP for a long time. How did you get your start with it?
I was working at a basically sort of a cell phone company, I guess you'd say. It's kind of a complicated situation, but they realized their system they'd kind of cobbled together wasn't going to scale or anything, so they wanted to do a pretty rushed project to do it, and so we worked up some sort of I guess you'd say a small iterative process, rather than the sort of rational process. There was RUP in the back in that day, of kind of a huge design process with, 89 different documents you might want and all that. And we developed kind of a little process for that. And that sort of alerted me enough that ended up going to an OOPSLA or something and heard about XP. And they taught the, I guess, Object Mentor and Kent Beck and Martin Fowler and so on taught an early range of XP classes. And I got into that from there. And then few projects under the belt in that style that got me going on it.
And how what was your experience with stories like in the beginning? How did you use them?
Well, I think like you, we were lucky we had somebody who really could articulate that customer viewpoint and had a perspective that wanted them. Actually, the first 2 or 3 projects I had were just very straightforward that way, that we were really lucky. One of them, we had the former call center manager and trainer was helping us produce stories for this customer support side of things. And they knew exactly what the problems were, much better than if we, sent an army of analysts or whatever you do back in the day, that they were the ones that had to teach people how to get around the problems and all that stuff. So they had great perspective on stuff. And they were, that first one was the one that really taught me, like, if you can do things partly manually, end to end, it's still a valuable thing. And you just can go in and automate a piece of that here and there, and until you're fully automated, and yet you're delivering value from way, way early. And I was just so delighted they had that perspective. It just like really opened my eyes, like, yes, we can do this all over the place.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that incremental adaptive approach is still really hard to find, I think.
Yeah.
And actually, that will be the subject of our book club in just a couple of weeks. We'll be looking at adaptive planning. There were some good conversations on the template and the idea of how do we, figure out how to write good stories. Drew Bryan wrote, honestly, I've never been on a team that's used a super defined story template and found great value in it. I think the standard story format is a good idea, but it often lacks the ability to be granular enough, or by the time it is, it starts sounding cheesy, especially for teams who increment in smaller, quicker cycles. However, on the positive, I like that the template forces you to A, identify who receives value from what you're doing, B, what you're doing, and C, the end user's goal in terms of value. I also like Joshua Karievsky's user story model, role, action, context, which is, of course, what you had mentioned. In general, I think the understanding of the end user and the value is delivered is important to capture, more important than adhering to a specific template. I think I would build on that and say, I think it's important that the team understand it, but I don't know that it's important to capture. But if using a template helps you create that understanding, then that's a win. Whatever works is great. Trolling Monkey has a comment appropriate to his or her name. Says, in my eyes, this is a weak attempt to introduce product thinking or even the mere concept of the customer. In practice, it is better to have a real product person to talk to and have acceptance with, which is very much along the lines of what we were talking about. And then Thomas Owen says, I'd agree with Drew Bryan. In fact, I've seen enough people spend way too much time trying to get the format right than it's worth. I've also seen a rigid format get in the way when trying to slice the work into thinner and thinner slices. However, being aware of the different formats can be helpful for the team to communicate. Knowing Connextra's user story format or a job story format that focuses on the task the user is doing, or an improvement story format that compares current to desired state, can be helpful to express the work in a way that is understandable by both the team as well as stakeholders. So I think we've kind of taken that one as far as we can go. Do you have anything else to say about helping people understand how to really focus on customer perspective when they're thinking about stories?
No, it sounds like we're all pretty aligned.
Well, let's move on then let's talk about splitting stories. You mentioned that you've modified the INVEST acronym recently to be scalable rather than small. To talk about, I assume that's about how stories can be made bigger or smaller.
Yeah. And I've tried to switch from the splitting. I don't know. I definitely use the idea of splitting and lots of different little tools in the toolkit to try and find some little crack where we can split it usefully. But I really try and get people to think more in terms of a minimal thing that accomplishes one thing for one person somehow, and then enriching it out and expanding on it. And sort of we talk about kind of like getting water through the pipes in an initial architecture of a system, and I kind of want the same thing in the story, that if we can create value for one person across the range of things, and then expand the stuff. So I really am on the lookout for techniques on those lines, that we can.
Yeah. Do you have any techniques that you can share? This is something that I always have trouble articulating. I when given a story, I can usually figure out how to split it down farther, but it's not necessarily something that I can easily describe how to do. Although I did try to give it my best shot for the book. So I'd love to hear from those of you watching, what are your techniques for splitting stories? And Bill, do you have any that you can share with us?
Well, I'll share some of the enriching ones. Maybe and go the other way if I can.
Yeah.
I think of one area is things where the computer adds some intelligence to things. So if you take VI back in the day, and then you sort of scroll forward to word processors now or development environments now, you have spell check and autofill and these anticipating things and little sidebars that pop up with stuff. So you're adding this richness around something that's not there in the initial thing. Another kind of area where you can expand, I think of history, and so uh, if you get Word documents, I mean, if you set it right, you can kind of go backwards in them and find what got edited when and undo and all those kind of things. Or you have Git where you can get your multiple versions. That's not really very common in outside of us developers,
Hmm.
and yet lots of people need stuff like that. They work with things that history matters. Um, I don't know. Sometimes there's transformations and connections we can do, make things visual that used to be textual and stuff like that. So, I want again, I want to get somebody starting doing something and then speed them up, whatever intelligence I can add. And often, if I can see them doing something, one of my former bosses described it as, they'll ask you for a tablespoon, and when you go watch what they're doing, you realize, they need a backhoe or something. And
Hmm.
if you can see something happening and see where the holes and the gaps and the lack of value are, or the places you can add things, I think that's a rich path to put things in and kind of follow your nose on what's really happening and seeing value coming through.
So start with sort of the basic that you hear people asking for, and figure out how to build it out into what is really needed.
Yeah, and I think it's so critical to even just get the basics out there and get people using it and giving you feedback and all that. I don't know. I see too many projects where it's like they want to go months to deliver the first bit of value to somebody, and lots of times there's value that can be done earlier. Maybe not full general use or anything like that, but there's lots of ways to try and get some use out of it first.
Mhm. Thanks. Tony has a comment. Tony, welcome to the show.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're coming through fine.
Okay, thank you. Uh, so I guess this one not more like I guess my experience how to split the story, but it's more like a questions that I have. So typically, I think as Bill mentioned, we try to get the skeleton of the features, or we try to slide as small as possible where we can release that skeleton. The difficult part or the trouble part that I usually run into is for the first kind of like usually for the first features or usually for the first skeleton. It usually takes us like at least sometime couple weeks or sometime even a month just to get some kind of like um, I guess scaffolding things in place or to try to tie the balls together. Even though we have also tried to make sure that whenever we can market, we market. Like if we need something from a third party, and then we say no, we don't need it, we can just market, and then we market. But most of the time, just the fact that we need to kind of like integrating things together and kind of like pull things together. So my question is, what is the trick that to make that skeleton, to make that building that skeleton, the first feature or the first iteration simpler and easier for people?
Mm. And I assume what you're asking here, Tony, is also about, at least in the book, I don't know what Bill's guidance is on this, but I'm saying 4 to 10 stories per week. And yet, if you're going to take a month to have that full walking skeleton, how do you make that customer centric? Is that part of what you're asking?
So that is kind of what I'm asking as well. And also the other side of it is sometimes our story can last more than a week.
Mm-hmm.
Just the fact that because that is the smallest customer centric value that we can deliver. And the fact that the we're working with the legacy system. So from time to time, just to pull it off is taking more than a week. Right?
Yeah. So, what's your take on this, Bill? Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have some theoretical reason why anything can be absolutely done in a week or anything like that, so
Yeah.
there may not be a way in your case, I don't know, but I think of that thing of most things, like maybe not I don't know. A lot of things people do, they've done somehow before, and they do something today, even if it's super clunky or whatever, to try and accomplish that thing. And if we're filling in something there, I mentioned like using manual methods or using whatever, I would take advantage of anything I could there. If it's some process and some person has to have two windows open and cut and paste from here to there in the middle, is it enough to get it through to somewhere where somebody can see the value come out of it? I know, like you said, if it's a legacy system and it's taking me days to even get inside of it, I don't know, what can I do? It's tricky. And I think we're supposed to, I have a group I work with, one of the groups I know, they're trying to upgrade like several versions forward on some underlying software. And, if they just try and turn on the new one, it doesn't work. There's just been too many versions between there. They've got to they've got to change stuff along the way, and there's no way to change halfway and turn on the new one at this point for them. And it's going to take them a while to get through that. They can leave other stuff in parallel, so somebody still's got value, but new value coming out because of it, it's not happening in a visible way to the customer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's kind of a non-answer, though, I recognize.
Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead, James.
Oh no, you were going to comment, Tony? Go ahead.
No, actually, I just say, yeah, that's exactly kind of what we've been dealing with too. We just look for the existing process and we try to use it as much as we can. And instead of we say, here's a value we deliver at the end of the process, here's a little value we deliver along the line. But even though it's still the whole tier ticket is not a couple of days, but sometimes it can last more than a week. But we try like, hey, here's a little thing that we can help a little bit along the way. Sorry, James, go ahead.
Oh no, I appreciate you following up. We've got Dan on the line, who looks like he has something to say about this. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you, James. Nice to be here. I think one way some people might think about this is you have all your stories and then you pull up this like splitting template and you look at it and you say, how can we split these? And you go through each story. And sometimes that puts a lot of burden on the team or takes a lot of time. Like, how do we split this? And I think one thing that we're touching on is a really powerful activity can be, have you created the conditions in your environment that are conducive to splitting or allow for splitting? Is the thing you're working on, is it stood up in production next to it? Can you do feature flags? Can you point some traffic at it? And so sometimes if you really want to support splitting, instead of creating a template or putting a lot of pressure on the teams, what can you do in the environment that would allow for the spikes to be possible? Tests in place, things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think that can be really valuable. And then once you have that in place, the hack we use a little bit is like relative sizing, like this is too big for a sprint or this is too big for a week. So instead of going through every story, the ones that are kind of big stand out and you're like, how could we do this differently? And so kind of spark conversation around the bigger ones once you have that environment in place.
Do you have any concrete examples of that you've faced recently that you could share?
On the spot.
Yeah, it's tough.
I don't have one that I could pull out that would be really valuable to this conversation. But thank you.
Well, I love that idea of making sure you got something in production there to create that context for things to happen. Because I've had too many projects that put the production part off till the end and then find out like, oh, we didn't talk to the security team or the this or the that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks very much for your comments, Dan.
Yeah.
This conflict between sometimes the stuff that we want to deliver is bigger than there's this idea of the stories, and you've moved away from this yourself, Bill, but there's this idea that the stories need to fit within an iteration, right? And of course, XP's iterations were originally 3 weeks and Scrum's iterations or sprints were originally a month. But now people are doing 1 week iterations or 2 week iterations. But even back then, even for me in that first, development website, for the operating system company, what we found was that the stories it's not always possible to do something in a week or 2 weeks, or we were using 3 weeks back in the beginning, that is truly valuable to our customers. And that's what inspired me to introduce this idea of valuable increments, which I called minimum marketable features in the first edition of the book. And almost called, I think you saw this, Bill, I almost called them S-ranked stories for the second edition before my reviewers shot that down real hard. But this idea that the things that we can deliver and the pieces that we use to show progress are not, they don't have to be tied together. We can show progress in small pieces, but only deliver to the customers less often than one, every week or even every 3 weeks. I know you were a reviewer on the book, Bill, and I don't recall you saying anything about that, positive or negative. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I in some ways, I feel like most of what I do is try and get teams to move forward and get things going. I agree that not everything is going to be a direct visible value to a customer at every release, and and if we're releasing, if we're on that lean end of things and we're releasing 10 or 50 or whatever times a day is the max people do, clearly most of that's not necessarily visible and certainly not marketable. Now does this little tiny thing nobody cares about, we don't sell that. So I don't mind that, but I got to say, I really try hard to make every little increment add something that improves things. And, but if I have to make it clear that there's, you won't see value XYZ until these things are in place, that's just a price if we just don't know how to make the increments and values smaller. I try, but I don't feel like I can always do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're almost out of time, but I want to give you a magic wand, Bill, and ask you if you could change just one thing about the way organizations approach user stories. So you've got this magic wand, you're going to wave it, and it's going to change the whole world instantly, and then you're going to wake up, unfortunately. But if you could do that, what would you change? What would you modify about the way people approach user stories?
I think I'm probably going to get too many buzzwords in to make it a one thing, but what I really want to see is whole teams focused on just a little bit of stuff at a time and making things happen, and not piling up a backlog that's going to satisfy us for a year and get lost in that, but just really focusing on what's the thing we're doing or the few things we're doing, and have all those perspectives we need in there to get it done, get it shipped, understand if it's giving us value, and making that happen on a regular basis. So is that 4 things or 1?
I don't know, but it sounds good to me. Reminds me of what Ron Jeffries says is the primary metric of software development is running tested features, right?
Right.
Getting those running tested features that people care about out the door makes a lot of sense to me. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. Bill, anything else you'd like to say to us? Anything that we should take away?
No, thanks. Great to be here.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining once again. Next week, we are going to be mixing things up by looking at customer examples and ubiquitous language. At first glance, one is a testing technique and the other is a design technique, but in reality, they're both about understanding your customer's problem domain. And I love understanding what customer needs. I particularly love understanding difficult problem domains. So I'm particularly looking forward to this conversation. I will be putting up the announcement and free reading soon. Keep an eye on jamesshore.com or follow the Discord at jamesshore.com/s/AOED2 Discord for more information. Thank you once again very much, Bill, for joining us. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And thanks you all for joining and for participating. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.